You got it.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much, Angela. So I always like to start our meetings with introductions. If anybody hasn't been with us before or it's been a while that would like to introduce themselves, we always like to know who we can network with and who's in the group. Or maybe if you've been here before, but you've got an interesting project going on that you want to talk about that is happening with your organization or personal project in the AAM space. All right. Well, if jump in later if you want to talk about anything new happening.
Hey, Andrew, this is Joe Darden with Iridium. I've been on the call sparingly over the last couple of years. So I work with Iridium. We do satellite connectivity. So we're the backup comm system, and we're safety comms and cockpit connectivity for oceanic.
That's super cool. Let's talk offline. I'd love to learn more about what you do and how we can help you to network with our membership better.
Okay.
Anybody else? How about events? I'm going to go to the Sun and Fun Air Show in Lakeland, Florida. It's ongoing now this week, and it'll run through Sunday. So I'm going to run up there Saturday and Sunday, which is Lakeland's between Tampa and Orlando. And it's sort of like a small, not that it's small, but it's not as big as Oshkosh, but it's in the same vein as a show. So that'll be fun. And I think if I understand correctly, we'll have some AAM representation there. I believe that Matt Chasen with Lyft will be there doing some flying. Their 18 rotor multicopter called Hexa, which would be really cool. I'm hoping to get to see it fly there. Will anybody else be at that event?
Hey, Andrew, this is Matt. I'll be there Saturday and possibly Sunday.
Outstanding. I will too. Maybe we can get together.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And totally an aside, but my son Josh is a senior here in South Carolina, and he was appointed to the U.S. Air Force Academy last week. So proud of him.
That's a big deal, Matt.
Yeah.
You must be over the moon.
I am. Can't imagine anything better.
I can't either. That's absolutely thrilling. Good for you. That's a big deal. And,
yeah, we were supposed to go to Oshkosh, but he'll be in basic training. So.
Wow.
So we're headed to Southern.
Wow.
Yeah.
He's on a heck of a fun track. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Good. Congratulations to you and your family.
Thank you.
Well, Matt, I guess I'll try to catch you at. Are you still going to Oshkosh then?
Yes, I am. We're actually we're a eVTOL manufacturer of personal two-seater eVTOLs, and we'll be displaying in the Agility Prime U.S.
Perfect.
Air Force booth. Yep.
I'll catch you there.
Perfect.
By the way, anybody who has followed what Andy was talking about, I had the chance to fly the Hexa myself, and I'll tell you what, it's a blast. So anybody who has a chance to go to Sun and Fun, please go. Even watching it fly, it's amazing.
Awesome. And Johnny, while you have the floor, I was curious, do you have any, by the way, Johnny Du is the leader of the other working group within Vertical Flight Society that's focused on transformative vertical flight, and his group focuses on public services, so police, fire, rescue, all the exciting stuff with sirens. Do you have any meetings lined up, Johnny, that we should know about?
Actually, a week from today, it will be 2 p.m. Eastern time, which is the Public Service Working Group standard regular meeting time. We are going to have Mandy Nelson, and she's the she currently leads the strategic relationship and business development for Bristol's AAM segment. Everybody knows that Bristol is one of the world's largest helicopter operating company. They are heavily into this AAM segment right now, investigating planning and organizing the future operations. So I would strongly suggest anybody who can make it a week from today, please join us. It's going to be a very interesting talk from Mandy.
That sounds like a great one. I'll be there. Thank you, Johnny. Appreciate
Yeah.
you putting that together.
No problem.
Outstanding. Any other events? We've got the big event for Vertical Flight Society is coming up next month. May 7th to 9th is the 80th forum of the Vertical Flight Society. That's going to be in Montreal, Quebec. Angelo, anything we should know about that event, or I think we've got another one coming up at Oshkosh as well, right? The Electric Aircraft Symposium.
Yeah, so Forum 80 in less than 4 weeks, I suppose, in Montreal. The weather should be great. Early bird registration ends today, so if anyone is interested in attending, or wants to ask for a few more days for that early bird rate, let me know. But again, early bird rate it's today's the 11th. So if you're interested in attending Forum 80, in addition to the Tuesday through Thursday content, the Monday we are working on something with Deloitte, potentially to tour one of their facilities that's sort of co-located near the convention center. And then of course Friday we have the tour of the Maribel facility, Bell's manufacturing facility up at the airport there. Folks are interested in getting a tour of the Bell facility as well. So we're excited. And then Electric Aircraft Symposium that weekend before Oshkosh. It was a big success last year, and we're planning, already in the planning process there now. We'll probably have a larger exhibit space, so if folks are interested in exhibiting, we're going to open up the back room for those that remember last year. That'll become an exhibit space, and we're not going to be as spread out in the presentation area as we were last year with circle tables. So there'll be a little more room for exhibits. Yeah, we're looking forward to that one too.
Right on. Both top-notch events. I went to both last year, and it just got tremendous value out of both. So I recommend them highly.
Hey, one more.
Any other? Yeah, Johnny.
Yeah, not directly AAM or eVTOL, but the Exponential, probably the world's largest drone conference, will take place in San Diego, which is one of the reasons why it's attractive to go there. But it will be in San Diego on the last week of April. And even though it's not directly eVTOL, a lot of eVTOL development technology and sensor suite, flight computer sensing, stabilization, even software, you can trace back not far from those drone development. And some of the heavy drones are the size of the eVTOL, what we call it. So anybody who's going to be able to attend the Exponential in San Diego, that may be a good one to attend.
Excellent. Thanks for bringing that up, Johnny.
To pile that one on, Johnny, next week is kind of a similar event in Amsterdam. They have Amsterdam Drone Week, but it's while it's heavily drone focused, there has been in the last couple of years a strong focus on advanced air mobility and scalability in the two different segments. And that's next week, the 16th through the 18th, I believe, in Amsterdam.
Excellent. I think there's another big commercial drone show. Is it in September in Las Vegas? And I'm probably getting all this wrong, but I think it was September.
It's in September. It's called Commercial UAV Conference in Las Vegas. And I'll see you guys there.
Oh, good. And I think I saw that the High Sky working group that's focused on hydrogen power for AAM is going to be co-locating their show with that event as well. Interesting stuff there. Good. What other events?
Oh, I had one more. For anyone that's in the Mosaic space for vertical flight, the ASTM 37 F-37 working group is meeting the spring meeting is in Oregon at Vans Aircraft from June 17th to 19th.
Oh, I'd love to see that. Are you going to go, Matt?
Yes, yeah.
That'll be a great one. Excellent.
There also going to be a conference, the AIA, or the Aviation Insurance Association conference in the I think it's the 2nd of May through the 6th, and we're going to have 2 panels. One is going to be oriented around use of telematics in the traditional pilot space, and then the second panel is going to be telematics and the unique insurance needs around AAM, and that one's going to have Alistair from SkyRisk, as well as Josh from USI, and should be a good conference.
That sounds great. Excellent. Thanks, Danny.
Mhm.
Any other events that are upcoming, or even that you've been to lately that you had notes on that you wanted to share?
Well, I just went to a AAM Summit conference in Orange County, California, last week. I was on the panel discussing the autonomous. I took the liberty of showing a little bit of footage of me flying the Hexa, again, pointing out that I did 5% of the flying, the airplane did 95%. So that was my point I tried to make on that. And it's a not too large a conference, but the attendee, high quality folks, it was well worth it. Yeah. So it's I think in the future years they're going to get some more momentum.
Johnny, I've seen that footage. You make Hexa look good.
Oh yeah, it's all me. Yeah, right.
Definitely.
It's all
Definitely.
the aviator, right, Johnny? So, Andrew, one more to kind of everybody maybe keep on their radar is the Aquasi, which is the Alaska UAS test site. They have an event in kind of mid-August. It's like the 13th and 14th in Fairbanks. And that's going to be the place that I see this crossover that happens between drones and AAM, because they've got a lot of middle mile package and people delivery that needs to happen in some of these areas that are really challenging. And so I think that's one to keep an eye on. And it's always best to go to Fairbanks in August versus January. So it's advantageous. It's about a
Love it.
90-degree temperature swing between the two.
Yeah, fantastic. Good. Any other events, past, present, future?
Yes, very briefly. We had a new conference debut in Europe 3 weeks ago. It's a bit of a mouthful. The name of the conference is Future Opportunities for Seaplanes and Amphibious Aviation. That's the name of the conference. We had Elfly there and Jector, and they're both developing 100% electric seaplane sort of amphibious thing. It's all about using all the technology that's being leveraged in the AAM space in the coastal community space on sort of coastal routes. There's a lot of activity in that space at the moment, and they want to see more interest from the wider advanced air mobility space in the seaplane use case.
That's great.
I'm sorry, is that going to be an annual event, or is it going to happen again next year, or?
Yeah, it's run by Keynote, and I think they're planning on running it again next year. It was quite popular.
Yeah, I would like to plan to attend next year. I also co-author the book called Wing and Ground Effect Machine. So I'm especially interested in that space. Thanks for letting us know. I'll try to attend. Yeah.
And Masood had a good request. If we've got a link to any of these events, feel free to drop them into the chat so we can jump in and check those out for ourselves. Thanks, Alistair. I see you already did. Perfect. Any other event conversations?
Hi, this is Marilana.
Hi
Hello.
there.
So now, because you say about United States, I give you one from Europe.
Perfect.
There is one is called Transport Research Arena. Have you heard? It's every
I
2
haven't.
years. I send you the link, and this year is in Dublin, and it's about all the transportation, all about mobility. So integrating everything. And
That's perfect.
I put you the link, and it will be next year. And next
Outstanding.
week. Next week.
Oh, right. Okay. Good. Oh, that's a good one.
On that seaplane conference, was there any proceedings or anything? And do they have a website, or where do you get information on that?
It's on
I
the
know Alistair.
Keynote website.
The what website?
Keynote, but key spelt like Quayside, Quaw, A-Y, Quay.
And Alistair was kind enough to post a link to that show as well in the meeting chat. I don't know if you saw that, Todd.
I'll have a look at the chat.
Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks, Matt. I see you posted the ASTM Mosaic session information. That's fantastic. Dr. Pavel did this for the Dublin event. Perfect. Thank you all. Any others? I wanted to say that since the Vertical Flight Society Forum will be the second week of May, that's when we normally have our working group meetings for this working group. And so we're not gonna have a working group meeting on the same day. So we won't be meeting in May. Our next meeting of the commercial air transport group, that is this group, will be after that in June. So we'll meet as usual in June and July, just not next month. Well, if there's no other event notes, Ken, did you have one? No. Okay. If there's no other event notes, I'd love to introduce our presenter for today, and I'll ask, just so that we don't have a lot of dogs and chickens in the background, maybe if everyone could mute so that we're quiet and respectful, I'd appreciate that. And there we go. I think it looks like we're all muted. Perfect. So I'm going to introduce Mike Rucinski. He's the CEO of Hawthorn Hill, and he's a consultant providing security and compliance consulting services to the aviation industry. Just in December, Mike has retired from more than 21 years of federal service. He was with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the Transportation Security Administration, or TSA, as we call it here in the States. He worked there with aircraft operators, industry associations, government partners, all discussing aviation policy, regulatory requirements, security programs. For example, as part of the TSA Aviation Security Advisory Committee, Mike actually launched the Advanced Air Mobility Working Group. So he was in that capacity working with industry stakeholders, including manufacturers, operators, infrastructure companies, helping them prepare for AAM operations in the national airspace system. He's worked to educate and facilitate discussions regarding the existing regulatory framework for security requirements, as well as the potential development of new programs to address the security needs of the AAM industry. That's perfect for us. Those are topics we've talked about in the past. We know we have to address in the future. We have different aircraft and different use cases operating in different places and in different ways than has been the case with conventional and traditional aircraft and airspace utilization. So with all these changes, we need some help and we need some guidance about how to maintain our physical security and keep our operators as safe as possible. So Mike is 100% the right guy for us to talk about this. I'm so happy to have Mike Rucinski here with us today. So with that, the floor is yours. Take it away, Mike.
Well, thank you, Andy, and thank you everyone for attending. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're connecting from. As Andy mentioned, I spent more than 20 years with Homeland Security, and most of that was with TSA, although I did work with some of the other components over the years, including THS headquarters. The last 5 years of my career was spent largely with the general aviation portfolio, and that is what put AAM into my realm. It's interesting when you talk about general aviation across the world, and certainly even within nations, there are different opinions or definitions, including official definitions that somewhat vary on what exactly is general aviation compared to commercial aviation. I've always actually liked the ICAO definition, which is actually all civil aviation operations other than scheduled air services and non-scheduled air transport operations for remuneration or hire. Basically, if you're getting paid to move passengers or cargo, ICAO says, well, that's not general aviation. FAA's had somewhat of a blended definition over the years. It's somewhat changed. It was basically originally anything that was not scheduled commercial service or military operations. All other was considered general aviation, although that's somewhat changed over the years as well. So when you talk about general aviation, or what's also known as aerial work in certain cases, you're talking about pilot training, business aviation, agricultural, crop spraying, law enforcement operations, search and rescue, medical operations, aerial survey work, aerial photography, news gathering, sightseeing and air tours, and flight demonstrations at air shows. So it encompasses a lot, and a lot of folks across the country or across the world don't realize that general aviation makes up more flights per day around the country than commercial aviation. So that's an interesting point as we go forward. Back in the halls of TSA, I can tell you that from a general aviation standpoint, we recognized that this thing called advanced air mobility was on the horizon, and we want to kind of get ahead of the curve, because I can tell you when we experienced the world of unmanned aerial systems, UAS, drones, again, there's a lot of conflation between terms, AAM, UAM, UAS, and we'll get into a little bit of that here. But we definitely saw unmanned aerial systems, whether that be everything from military operations to a hobbyist playing with drones, that crept up on us rather quickly. I always used to say I had been on the AAM speaking circuit for a couple of years before retiring. And I always used to say, UAS was kind of the alligator a mile, 2 miles from the boat, because there's so much else going on. And like I said, it was either considered a military thing or a hobbyist thing. And then the technology came so fast and the industry grew so fast that it went from an alligator miles from the boat, and we blinked our eyes and it was an alligator in the boat with us. And all of a sudden, there were all these things that the federal government needed to look at about how do you handle these things in airspace? How do you handle them from a threat? How do you handle counter UAS systems and so forth? So I wanted to get ahead of the curve, and as Andy mentioned, created the Advanced Air Mobility Working Group within TSA. I'll get into it a little bit more about where that operated within TSA. But again, the idea is that we're talking about here, for the purpose of this presentation, to try and segment UAS, UAM, so on and so forth. I'm talking about AAM passenger operations in general. And again, when you talk to different folks about different definitions, there are some blurring or blending of the lines, but that's okay. We generally have an understanding of where we're going. FAA defines AAM as an umbrella term for aircraft that are likely highly automated and electric. These aircraft are often referred to as air taxis or eVTOLs, electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. If you get into the Advanced Aviation Infrastructure Modernization Act, it's a little bit more detailed and says advanced air mobility is defined as an air transportation system that transports individuals and property between points using aircraft such as remotely piloted, autonomous, or vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. So like I said, even within a single country, you'll have various definitions and takes on it. So, but for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to kind of stick with passenger aircraft. Andy, do you have the slide deck up? There we go. Next slide. Okay, so again, there's a little bit about my background, a little bit about the history in TSA for AAM. I mentioned I started the AAM working group. That was within what's known as the Aviation Security Advisory Committee. For those that may not know what that is, that was a congressionally mandated committee started after the Lockerbie bombing in 1988, I believe that was, over Scotland with Pan Am Flight 103. And basically that is a committee filled with family, victims of the family, and aviation stakeholders that then at the time worked with FAA with all sorts of security concerns post that incident. That has maintained since 1988. And then once TSA was born, so to speak, that was transferred from FAA to TSA. And I'll get a little bit into that transition as well. I also, prior to retirement, served on the Department of Transportation's AAM Interagency Working Group. That started in spring of 2023, and that basically had all federal agencies that had any type of involvement or potential involvement with AAM. You know, when we talk about AAM, the first hurdle for all these folks, the OEMs creating these aircraft, obviously is the FAA, right? It's the FAA that's going to certify the aircraft and deal with airspace issues and so forth. Once these OEMs get certified for civil aviation operations and moving passenger and cargo for hire, their next step, depending on their operation, is TSA for security regulations. Right now, obviously, most of them are deeply involved with getting through the FAA hurdles. However, TSA is right behind that from a regulatory standpoint. And again, we'll chat a little bit more about that. Next slide, Andy. Okay, so aviation security post 9/11, after the attacks on September 11th, 2001, resulting in the deaths of nearly 3,000 people, the Transportation Security Administration was created on November 19th, 2001 via Public Law 10771. At that time, there was no such thing as the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. That was created after 9/11 as well. So when the TSA was created, it was actually placed under the Department of Transportation, which is the same office that the FAA resides. The Homeland Security Office was created a year later in on November 25th, 2002. And then TSA was moved from the DOT to under DHS, where it has remained ever since. Generally speaking, that transition between TSA and FAA, TSA took over all things security in aviation. FAA kept all things from the safety side. That includes airspace management, air traffic control, aircraft certification, etc. But if it had something to do with security, TSA took that over. Incidentally, a lot of folks don't realize that TSA also has transportation security. Again, it's in the name, but people don't realize they're responsible for surface and rail. So trucks and buses and passenger rail and freight rail, even pipeline. A lot of people don't realize pipeline is considered a transportation mode. So oil and gas pipelines actually fall under the realm of TSA regulation and authorities. So it's kind of an interesting side note. But obviously, most people equate TSA with the aviation side because that's where most of the public will interface with the TSA. But there's a lot more behind it, I can tell you, besides just aviation. Next slide. So again, I already mentioned that the Aviation Transportation Security Act is what created TSA. And then when you get into the kind of the meat of things, and I'm going to try very hard not to send people into a sleep or stupor by reading you word for word regulations, because there's no better way than to fall asleep. I highly recommend it. If you have sleep problems, just crack open the Code of Federal Regulations on any page and just start reading. So we'll try and narrow that down to what's important to us and talk about it from a very high level. As you might imagine, there are always all sorts of caveats and you know, it depends type of things when it comes to asking questions about, well, what happens when this happens, or what's the requirement for that? Well, it depends. So we'll try and avoid all those rabbit holes and speak at a high level. But basically, if you go to Title 49, Chapter 12, Part 1500 and above in the Code of Federal Regulations, you will find the aviation security regulations, as well as some of the TSA surface things. I listed, or I pulled out 1542 and 1544 here, because that deals directly with airport and air carrier requirements. And then again, this is public information. You can jump on the internet and go to what's called eCFR. And dial this up, and you can read these things for yourself. It's public information, it's dry, and as we'll get to in just a minute, it's also very, very basic. When you read the requirements in 1542 and 1544 and so on, you'll notice that it's very skeletal. It's an outline. That is obviously by design, because you wouldn't put the details of your security program and your requirements in publicly facing material. What 1542 and 1544 does, for example, is let an aircraft operator or an airport operator know that, hey, this is the type of operation I perform. Where do I fall in the regulations? And when you find that, then you find what program you must adhere to, okay? And it is in those programs where, again, when they say the devil is in the details, it is in those programs that is the meat of your security program, the details of how you conduct security for your operation. That information, obviously, is not public information. It's what's known as sensitive security information, or SSI. People are very familiar in just secret spy world or popular movie genres about secret classifications and top secret classifications. SSI is not considered that same type of classification for information, but it is protected under the law. And in fact, I don't have it on here, but if you go to 49 CFR 1520, you'll see all the rules and regs behind sensitive security information. So it is protected. It's not open to the public. It is the requirement of those airport operators, aircraft operators, anybody with a security program. They're required to protect that information. And again, I'm not going to get into the details of that, but it's extensive. So what are we talking about when we're talking about some of these security programs? Well, again, after 9/11, when security regulations were tightened up significantly, there's also the understanding that there are many, many types of aircraft operations, right? And the idea of what people see when they know about or interface with TSA is what most people typically deal with in their experience if they're not in the aviation industry. Their experience with aviation is to buy a ticket on a commercial airline and fly from one end of the country to the other, or regionally, or maybe across the pond to the UK or where have you. And that's what they understand aviation to be. And certainly that is what has the most security regulations behind it. So that aircraft operator SSP, that would be where your major airlines fall under. That is what requires the full TSA screening when you go through the airport. Again, what most people have experienced. That is for domestic carriers, by the way. There's another one I didn't list called the MSP, which is the Model Security Program, which is for foreign carriers coming and going from the US. And again, that's what most people realize and understand in their world, what aviation security is. And I can tell you, if security, the regs for security are this thick, security screening, passenger security screening are this thick, then I can tell you all the other regs that people don't see stand several feet high. And that's not an exaggeration. I used to do that as an example during presentations to stack all these programs up. So when people assume that aviation security is passenger screening, it's like, well, that's a piece of it. And actually, in the big scheme of things, not a huge piece compared to the rest of it. But it was also realized, again, post 9/11, that you could not necessarily handle all of aviation operations with that level of screening, nor would it require it necessarily from a risk standpoint. So you have these other programs in here where you see the 12.5 program, the private charter program. SSP, by the way, stands for Standard Security Program at the end of each of those. DCA Access SSP, known as DASIP. Any general aviation aircraft coming into Ronald Reagan National Airport in Washington, D.C. has its own program, just based on the sensitivity of the airspace there in D.C. Again, it is in those programs. It's where the operators learn what they have to do with their requirements for screening and physical security and all the other things I mentioned that stack several feet high. It's not the same for every operation, okay? And this is where we're going to get into kind of the discussion. Well, where's AAM fit into this? So, for example, 12.5, if you look at the Code of Federal Regulations, 12.5 is kind of the threshold where when you're operating with an aircraft, what 12.5 refers to, by the way, is the maximum takeoff weight of an aircraft. So fully loaded with passengers and fuel, that is the MTOW. Actually, go back a second, Andy. Yeah, thank you. That is the size of the aircraft at 12,500 pounds. That's typically, and again, you have to understand there's always caveats and things, but generally speaking, 12,500 pounds MTOW is where an aircraft is starting to have to follow security rules. Okay. And again, this is assuming that you're carrying passengers for hire. If you own that aircraft yourself and it's used for recreation, and you're not flying into the sterile area, which we'll also get to in a minute, then you might not have any security requirements at all. One of the things I did not list on here, I meant to, the ASP, the Airport Security Plan. Okay, they also, again, have their own plan and how they need to define areas of the airport and segments of the airport that need protection, baggage handling areas or what have you. Okay, the tarmac, the sterile area. What's the sterile area? Well, again, generally, if you've come through a U.S. airport and you've been screened by TSA and you get to the other side, that other side where you've been screened is the sterile area. The other side was the public area. That's where you came from, okay? And you know from experience probably that if you're in the sterile area and you need to go back to your car and get something, you've crossed back out of the sterile area. You are no longer sterile from a screening standpoint. You got to go through screening again, coming back from the public area, okay? Airports need to define how that is, all their access points and so forth, as you might imagine. Other parts of an airport, generally, again, defined in an airport security program, would be, for example, the FBO, the fixed base operator. For folks that don't know what that is, the great analogy, I'm a boater also. The great analogy for an FBO is it's a marina. Similar for boats, right? It's where aircraft may reside. It may have a hangar over on that side of the airport that's not mixed in with the commercial operations. And there's where private jets and business jets may keep their aircraft, or it may be a place where they're only stopping temporarily, right? They're landing there, their customers are doing business for several days, and then they're taking back off to their home airport, where again, their aircraft is likely kept at an FBO or a hangar in airport property elsewhere. So how all those lines are drawn for security and what kind of security you need to come and go from those locations, also defined in the airport security program. And with all these programs, it's important to note, like I said, when you realize that in looking at the CFRs, there's not much there. It's because the meat is in the program. TSA basically tells these operators, airport operators or aircraft operators, this is what you have to protect, but how you do it is up to you. There are bare minimum requirements and things like that, but you can have two aircraft operators that are basically identical in nature, or airports that choose to meet those requirements in different ways. And that's why security programs can differ from operator to operator, aircraft operator to operator, airport operator to operator. They don't all look the same necessarily. They have a minimum set of requirements, and then how you do that is up to you. Okay, next slide. So with this laid as a very, very simplistic, basic groundwork, again, in the interest of time, where does AAM fit into all this? Okay, aircraft weight and passenger load, like I said, that has a lot to do with where you fall for a security program, if any. What are your requirements? What's the type of operation? Are you doing just sightseeing tours? You know, you're taking off. Again, anybody that's been to Manhattan or the Grand Canyon may have taken a helicopter sightseeing tour. You probably weren't screened based on that. There might not be screening requirements identical to what you experienced when you flew into JFK to get to New York City, right? But certain requirements for, again, as we mentioned earlier, sightseeing tours and things like that differ from other requirements based on the operation. What kind of sterile area access are these aircraft going to be looking to be interested in? Next slide. As a quick sampling of maximum takeoff weight, you know, I toss out numbers sometimes, and again, folks with maybe not a great background in aircraft systems or aircraft sizes, there's your general takeaway from MTOW, a Cessna Skyhawk at 2550 pounds, 4 passengers, including the pilot. King Air 250, roughly 12,500 pounds. Boeing 737 at 174,000. And again, these are approximations, as you all know. There's all sorts of different things you can do to change up aircraft for configuration, for passenger seating, passenger load, engine configurations that can change that. But those are just some general numbers to give people kind of an idea of where you're at from a standpoint of maximum takeoff weight. Next slide. So again, where does AAM fit into all of this? And it is very complex. I can take the simplest route and tell you, if I wanted to use the definitions I've given you and use the weight thresholds and passenger loads, I could technically say that, at least right off the bat, AAM, the vehicles that we know, the aircraft that we know are coming into the AAM world from the various OEMs, who you're probably all familiar with. They're all falling underneath, at least at this present time, underneath that 12,500 pound threshold. Okay, so if they follow the rules and stayed, for example, outside of the sterile area and flew FBO to FBO, fixed based operator to fixed based operator, they might not have any security requirements per se. Okay, now that's all being relooked at, by the way, and I'll get into that in a minute as to why. But again, if I had a small aircraft and I was paying or taking paying customers to fly from one location to another in a little Cessna, and I did not load or unload my passengers into the sterile area, I may not have any screening requirements for the passengers. Okay, and again, people may have experienced that in different things. If you've ever gone on one of those sample flights because the flight school is trying to get you to become a pilot, and they take you up and they fly around a bit, and you land back at that airport, probably flew out of an FBO or a general aviation airport. My guess is you weren't screened. Now, understand, operators, airport operators, aircraft operators, they can always go above and beyond what the government requires as a bare minimum, but many of them will just do what they have to do and maybe not do more than that. And again, that's fine. That's where the thresholds are set. It's important to note also, checking my notes here on the other screen, when you look at the airports across the US as an example, and you get an understanding of how much more aircraft are in the air that are GA versus commercial, just using very broad terms. There are roughly 400 airports. I think the last number was 435 because it changes, it flexes. There are roughly 400 airports across the US where TSA performs screening functions, okay, for scheduled operations of what you would traditionally know to be commercial flights. So roughly 400 airports, whereas there are roughly 5,000 public use airports around the country, okay? Only 400 some odd of those are screened with TSA. 5,000 are general aviation airports that may not have scheduled service. Again, we're talking about business jets coming and going, recreational aircraft, all the other examples of GA that I mentioned, okay? And what they may require or not require is found in those programs we talked about just a few minutes ago, okay? Above and beyond that, there's roughly 14,000 private use heliports, airports, and seaplane ports around the country, okay, that might belong to a company or a helipad on top of a business building that is not for public use, it's for private use, for their private helicopter use, as an example. So there's a lot out there, and a lot of folks don't realize that. I've done speaking engagements where, I ask people in the audience, hey, just for the U.S. As an example, give me a number of airlines you think are out there, or better yet, the number of airline operations or aircraft operations that carry passenger or cargo for hire. And most people in their head will run through the big names that everybody's aware of, okay, and maybe come up with a dozen or 20 or so, and more than that a little bit if you include foreign carriers that come into the U.S. Well, there's over 600 or 700 of them. Okay, and again, most people are unaware of that because they're typically buying a commercially or regularly scheduled aircraft commercial ticket, and there's a lot out there people don't recognize, and they all have varying levels of security. So now AAM's coming on the scene, and they want to know where they fit in. And as I mentioned, well, based on your size and passenger load, you might not have any security requirements off the bat if you're going FBO to FBO. Why are we concerned about the sterile area? Well, if that same aircraft brings in somebody to the sterile area, remember, we said sterile is after screening. And as you know, if you've flown through a major US airport, you realize that once you go through screening, let's say you're connecting midway across the country, you're not forced to go back out and be screened again. You're in the system. You're in the sterile system now. So you're going to get to your gate or arrive at your gate, figure out where your next leg of the trip is, walk down to that gate. That's all in the sterile area. Okay. So the concern is if I'm an AAM operator and I want to bring my passengers into the sterile area so they can have that convenience. And they want this, by the way. I've spoken with many OEMs. This is what they're looking to do. Maybe not right off the bat based on security requirements, and they need to figure out how that's going to work. But that is one of the business models, right? I use the Washington, D.C. area. There's a suburb of Washington, D.C., Leesburg. It's probably about half hour, 45-minute drive on a good day. There's never a good day in D.C. traffic. But let's say half hour, 45 minutes from D.C., and I want to get to DCA, Ronald Reagan National Airport. And maybe instead of, again, the 45-minute drive or more so, or same thing in the New York City area, Los Angeles, I want to jump on my AAM that's operating out of a park and ride a half mile down from my house and get there in 5 minutes, right? And land in the sterile area and then board my flight that's going to take me to Japan or California or whatever. That's what these folks are looking to do. That's what these OEMs are looking to do, these operators are looking to do in the future. Now that obviously, if I bring those folks there, that's going to require the same type of screening requirements for anybody else that's coming through the sterile area, through that front door of that airport at Dulles or JFK. If I now mix my passengers in there, they have to have that same level of screening, understandably, because now once they enter that system, there's no screening for them or requirements, further screening requirements for them. So do I do the screening on the front end from that park and ride? Or the high-rise building that I took off from in the city area? Do we set up screening there somehow? Is there some possibility for private screening options? How will all that work? That's all being discussed as we speak. Could I bring my folks to the sterile area and have another area within the sterile area where they actually do get screened by TSA or TSA required services, required screening requirements? This is all up in the air. This is all what's being worked. As I mentioned earlier, right now, FAA is the biggest hurdle for these guys. But shortly thereafter, when they want to take paying passengers, depending on what their operation is, TSA is now getting very involved with these discussions. Again, here on the slide, I've got the variations we've talked about AAM, piloted versus automation, remote hybrid. An urban environment is another thing. It's like, okay, well, why if these regulations currently don't affect, as long as they stay out of the sterile area, these regulations don't affect AAM, why might they change? What is being scrutinized? Well, now the OEMs will tell you it'll be years just based on supply and demand before this happens, but the conversation that goes on about the skies will darken with these things, right? And yes, even though I look at New York City or major city areas and say, yeah, there's a handful of helicopters flying around, it's not a lot from a volume standpoint. And between the volume and the urban environment, does that change your risk profile? The answer is yes. Typically, just based on numerical calculation, the more passengers you have in the air, the more concern also comes along with risk per se, okay? And public awareness that these things even exist. Cabin and cockpit security is another one. Obviously, these aircraft are so small, you don't have necessarily the protection for the pilot. That is being looked at. Passenger screening, we've already mentioned. Public acceptance, I can tell you after talking to many OEMs, certainly, regardless of whether it's required by the government in the country that they're operating, they have their own interest in security, right? It's not good for public acceptance to have an incident, security incident, within a month or two after you launch your service. Regardless of how big the aircraft is, there'll be a lot of media coverage, there'll be a lot of public awareness. So even though there may not be security regulations on the books, so to speak, right now, these OEMs and operators do have an interest and they're trying to figure out what's best for them. And while trying to maintain that balance between a frictionless experience for your passenger, as well as having the security that you want to protect your passengers, not to mention your aircraft, obviously. Ease of use in flight is another one when you get back into the idea of cockpit security and cabin security. The idea that these days, I think Johnny mentioned earlier, right, that the aircraft does 95% of the flying, right, versus your 5%. I used to be a model airplane guy myself many years ago, and it took skill. Well, there's no skill involved anymore. I'm broad brushing that, obviously, but take your hands off the stick, and generally, it'll keep the hover, right? Do that with a helicopter, not necessarily the case. There's there's a lot of training and skill. So the idea is if I have concerns over cockpit security and ease of use, is that a concern? So what systems can you build into your aircraft to handle that, right? To handle a potential cockpit takeover or what have you. You know, commercial aircraft have rules on that cockpit door, and if you've flown, you may see when folks come and go out of the cockpit. And there's methods they use to bring the catering carts in front, right, as a barrier when that cockpit door is opened. If a pilot needs to use the restroom or get to the back of the aircraft for some reason, right? So again, all those security rules we talked about and regs. Last but not least, and I'm going to try and wrap it up here for questions. I think we get like less than 10 minutes. Cybersecurity, right? The closer I get to automation and electric flight, the concern and the buzzword these days, obviously, and throw in AI, right? Cybersecurity. What is the concern over cybersecurity, especially when you start to get into automation or remote flying? If these aircraft are being controlled from systems on the ground navigation systems, GPS systems. You may have seen in the news, there's been all sorts of concerns about GPS being spoofed in foreign countries that have caused commercial airlines difficulties. Well, if these are even more automated, what is the concern there? These are not necessarily being built by your traditional aircraft manufacturers who, again, the handful that you would be aware of, obviously, just in popularity, many of these are being built from scratch by OEMs as startups, and what kind of security protocols do they have in the equipment that they're using, the cybersecurity protections for how that system may be attacked and either taken over or disabled to cause some sort of problem with the aircraft. That's the general gist of it. I know I've spoken for about 25 minutes, so Andy, I'll turn it back over to you. Oh,
right on.
I'll add this. Sorry, yeah. Last slide. As Andy mentioned, I retired in December of 2023, actually on December 30th. On January 1st, I started this company, and I was fortunate to be very busy pretty quickly. Like I said, I had spent 5 years working with the industry, so when I announced my retirement for the folks that I had been working with over the years, I had a lot of good contacts to start. But by all means, I'm always looking to assist others. There's a variety of stakeholders in the industry. It's not just your airport or aircraft operator. There's a lot of folks that are interested in this for their own reasons from a business standpoint. So please feel free to email me and we can chat. Thank you, Andy.
Love it. Outstanding content and great information for all of us. By raise of hand or scream, are there any questions out there before I throw some dumb ones in the mix? We'd love to hear from you about your thoughts.
I have a question.
Sergio, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, no camera because I don't look any even remotely good. Good morning. Thank you so much, Michael. It was very interesting. So, question for you. Many times when we look at these AAM, let's call them eVTOLs, right, for these air taxi services, we equate them to the large transport aircraft because of the frequency, et cetera, et cetera. So in that case, you had mentioned it. So there is rules for physical separation of the cockpit, right, after 9/11. What is, and you say that there is discussion taking place. What is the take from the TSA? Will they require a physical separation of the pilot from, of the cockpit from the cabin, or not? What's the direction?
So again, literally, when I tell you that these are discussions that are happening as we speak, they are. I obviously have now left the government, and I can't speak for them. I can look at what's already been done with other aircraft, and again, I used the example before. For example, helicopter services. Okay, helicopter services, whether it's used for transport or simple sightseeing, they typically don't have those same requirements, and they may be even heavier than the electric aircraft that we're talking about. So you can imagine from an industry standpoint, they don't want to be necessarily more heavily regulated than what's already in existence for essentially doing the same thing. In fact, in defense of the AAM industry, one might argue that those aircraft are safer in that What are we looking at when we're looking about the risk post 9/11? A lot of it is the aircraft size, weight, and fuel load, right? That is what caused the damage. Now, of course, there's the obvious concerns about the passenger safety and security on board, but from an attack venue, to use that aircraft as a missile, so to speak, that's where those thresholds come into play about, we understand there's the concern no matter what, but what is the risk of that aircraft, that weight and fuel load of the aircraft? So now if I try and have that same discussion with AAM, I say, well, look, the aircraft is far less of a weight concern. It doesn't have any fuel. And depending on who you talk to about the battery situation, a lot of folks get concerned about, well, lithium batteries, they're very explosive and very dangerous. Well, if you really know a lot about lithium batteries, you'll know that there's a lot of different chemistries for lithium batteries, okay? And there are some that are far more stable and that if dropped from a high altitude will spark and smoke and fizzle, but not burst into flames like Jet A fuel, right? So that's also something to be considered. So back to your question about now, how do I protect the cockpit? Still in discussion. But again, if we haven't required it post 9/11 of similar size or even heavier aircraft in traditional venues, right? Turbines and Jet A, what's changing that I'm going to do it now or require it now for electric motors and batteries, right? Is there a reason for it? Now, like I said, there are arguments on the other side that said, well, as I mentioned, well, yeah, the volume, just the fact that, if there's, and I'm just going to pick a number, 100 flights a day in a metropolitan area for scenic tours, okay? But now with AAM and air taxis, these things are so prolific that there's thousands of flights a day. Does that change my risk profile? Does that change my concern? And maybe the answer is yes, okay? But I can tell you that literally, as of this point, there is no leaning one way or the other. It is all being discussed as we speak because this is so new.
And we just have 2 minutes
Thank you.
left.
I had a quick question.
Justin, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm new to this group, and we're SkyGrid is working with Whisk, which is one of the new folks that you mentioned. So we're specifically wondering about the cybersecurity part of that, and how we're going to be able to connect a system like that to NAS, which, as we know, is critical infrastructure. So do you have any thoughts on that, or where we could get started, or who to talk to? I know you're more physical security, but
well, so again, by all means, I am not a cybersecurity expert. I can assist where systems are identified as what's concerning, right? As far as what they control and what they do. The other issue, again, as we mentioned with cybersecurity, actually, I probably didn't get into this too much, and I know we're running out of time. The other interesting about cybersecurity, it happens to be one of those places where there's the overlap, because the aircraft certification is still handled by the FAA, right? So when you talk about the integrity of the avionics and so on and so forth, even though it has security in the name, where TSA does have purview, that has always been the realm based on the aircraft certification process of the FAA. So I can tell you those discussions are happening as well, as far as where that overlap is and where the lines of responsibility will be drawn. And again, we're running out of time, but shoot me an email. We can continue this conversation and have a little bit more depth to it. But yeah, no, it is a huge factor for many reasons. And I can have an entire 1-hour presentation on that very, very easily.
Mike, thank you so much. I've for everyone's ease of access, I've dropped your name and email address and website into the chat. So everyone, please grab that so you have a great way to get in touch with Mike. He's on LinkedIn as well. And Mike, thank you so much for joining us today. This is a wonderful presentation and really a great intro to a dialogue that's going to be ongoing for, well, indefinitely.
Well, thank you. And thank you all for attending.
Wonderful. And Angelo, I think we can hit the stop record button.
Are you sure you want to stop recording?